Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going deep on a book that's, it's pretty intense.
Yeah, intense is one way to put it.
The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. Have you heard of it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's a real eye-opener, you know? It makes you question, like, everything.
That's what I thought.
Oh.
So we've got excerpts ready to go, and thankfully, we've got an expert here to help us unpack it all.
Happy to help.
So the Shock Doctrine, it's basically this idea that, like, huge societal changes, they happen best when a society is already in chaos.
Right, exactly. Like when there's a war or a natural disaster or even a financial meltdown. These moments, they kind of create this, like, opening
For what, though?
for pushing through radical policies, economic policies mostly, the kind of stuff that people would normally fight tooth and nail. But when they're in shock, well, it's easier to get things done.
It's kind of like taking advantage of someone when they're down, isn't it?
That's one way to look at it, yeah.
Yeah.
And Klein, she traces this idea all the way back to Milton Friedman, you know, the economist.
Oh, yeah, the Nobel Prize guy.
That's the one. He was a big believer in using these windows of opportunity, as he called them. He even said that a new administration, they only have like 6 to 9 months to make those big changes before the public starts pushing back.
Wow, so it's all about speed, isn't it? Hit them hard and fast.
Exactly, like ripping off a Band-Aid, but on a societal level.
Ouch. So where does Machiavelli fit into all of this? I thought he was like a political philosopher or something.
He was, and Friedman actually drew a lot of inspiration from him. You know that famous Machiavelli quote, "If an injury has to be done to a man, it should be so severe that his vengeance need not be feared."
Right. Brutal.
Well, Friedman, he applied that logic to economics. He argued that to get the economy right, you needed swift and radical change. It's the only way to overcome resistance, he said.
So basically, shock the system into submission.
Kind of, yeah. It's a pretty controversial idea, to say the least. But Klein, she argues that this is exactly what's been happening all over the world, and she points to Chile in the 1970s as the first major example.
Chile, right after the coup that brought Pinochet to power.
Exactly. That's when the shock doctrine, it really went from theory to practice.
So how did it actually play out in Chile?
Well, you had this group of economists, Chilean guys, who had studied under Friedman at the University of Chicago.
They were called the Chicago Boys.
Yeah, the Chicago Boys. And after the coup, they basically got free rein to reshape the Chilean economy.
And they went all in on Friedman's ideas, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. Full throttle. Tax cuts, privatization, deregulation, the whole 9 yards. All implemented in, like, no time at all.
It must have been a whirlwind, and I imagine a lot of people got hurt in the process.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just some abstract economic theory. People's lives were upended, and all this economic upheaval, it happened alongside brutal political repression. Pinochet's regime, they weren't messing around.
It's a scary thought. Using a crisis to force through an agenda, regardless of the human cost.
And that's exactly what Klein is arguing. She says this economic shock therapy was only possible because people were so terrified. They couldn't speak out, couldn't resist.
So fear and disorientation become tools, almost.
In a way, yeah. And get this, the Chicago Boys, they actually had a 500-page plan for all this. They called it the BRIC. It was basically a roadmap for imposing radical free market policies in the midst of chaos.
Wow, a blueprint for shock therapy.
Mm-hmm.
And Chile was just the beginning, wasn't it?
It was just a taste of things to come. Klein argues that the shock doctrine, it went global after that.
So we're talking about a pattern here, a pattern of exploiting crises to push through an agenda.
Exactly. And to really understand it, we need to look at how this theory was applied in other countries, starting with another chilling example, Argentina during the Dirty War. But that's a story for another time. So Argentina in the 70s. It was a country, well, it was a mess. Economic instability, political turmoil, you name it.
A recipe for disaster, it sounds like.
It was, and that's when the military junta took over in 76.
Ooh, the Dirty War. A dark period, to say the least.
It was brutal. Systematic violence, disappearances, torture. You know, anyone who even looked at the regime the wrong way, they were in danger.
Tens of thousands of people gone. It's hard to even imagine. But was there more to it than just, you know, a power grab? I mean, how does this tie into the shock doctrine?
Well, Klein argues that the violence, it wasn't random. It was a key part of their economic strategy.
Okay, so the terror was used to, like, clear the way for their economic agenda.
Exactly. They needed to create an atmosphere of fear, of paralysis, so that people wouldn't resist the changes they were making. And guess who was advising them on these economic reforms?
Don't tell me, the Chicago Boys.
Yeah, more Friedman's disciples. They swooped in and implemented the same playbook they used in Chile. Privatization, deregulation, slashing social programs, all while the junta was, doing its thing.
So the shock of the coup and the ongoing terror, it created this perfect environment to force through those radical policies.
It's a pretty grim picture, isn't it? And it gets even weirder when you consider the role of institutions like the Ford Foundation.
The Ford Foundation, what do they have to do with this?
Well, they were funding human rights groups that were trying to expose the junta's crimes, which is, a good thing. But at the same time, they were also supporting the very economists who were advising the junta on their economic policies.
So they were playing both sides.
It seems that way. It's a complicated situation, to say the least, and it shows how even well-intentioned actions can backfire in these complex situations.
No kidding. But Argentina, it was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The shock doctrine, it really went global in the 80s, didn't it?
Oh, yeah. The 80s was a time of massive upheaval. The Cold War was ending, the global economy was shifting. It was prime time for the shock doctrine.
So where do we even begin? Latin America, Africa, the fall of the Soviet Union? It's a lot to cover.
It is. But let's start with the debt crisis that hit Latin America and Africa in the 80s. That's when the IMF and the World Bank, they really stepped onto the world stage.
Right, those institutions that are supposed to help countries in need.
That's the idea. But their methods, well, they're often pretty controversial. They offered loans to these struggling countries, but with some pretty strict conditions.
Conditions like what?
Things like slashing social programs, privatizing state industries, opening up their markets to foreign competition, the usual free market stuff.
But these countries, they were already struggling. Wouldn't those measures just make things worse?
They often did. Klein calls it economic shock therapy. And she argues that in some cases, the IMF and the World Bank actually made the crises worse on purpose. Withholding funds, creating artificial shortages, just to force these countries to accept their demands.
So it was like economic blackmail.
Kind of, yeah. And all in the name of free market ideology. And this wasn't just happening in developing countries. Margaret Thatcher, she was doing the same thing in the UK. She was all about crushing unions, privatizing everything, shrinking the welfare state.
Thatcher was a force of nature, wasn't she? She went head-to-head with the miners and won.
She did. And her victory, it kind of paved the way for similar policies all over the world. But maybe the most dramatic example of the shock doctrine, it was the collapse of the Soviet Union.
That was a game changer for sure.
It was. And the West, they saw it as a golden opportunity to reshape the region according to their own vision. So they brought in economists, guys like Jeffrey Sachs, who had experience with shock therapy in other countries.
So they took the Chilean model and they tried to apply it to Russia.
Basically, yeah. But Russia, it was a different beast altogether. And the transition, well, it was a disaster. Millions of people were plunged into poverty, life expectancy plummeted, the whole country was in chaos.
It's almost hard to believe that they thought it would work.
Well, that's the thing about ideology, isn't it? It can blind you to reality. And even though the Russian experiment was a failure, the IMF and the World Bank, they kept pushing for the same kind of shock therapy in other former Soviet countries.
So they didn't learn their lesson.
Apparently not. But despite all this darkness, there are stories of resistance. People fighting back against the shock doctrine, creating alternatives. Like in Argentina, in 2001, you had this massive popular uprising against the IMF. People took to the streets, they overthrew the government, they rejected the IMF's dictates.
People power, huh? It's good to know that it's possible to fight back.
It is. And there are other examples, too. Klein talks about left-leaning governments in Latin America, community-based reconstruction efforts after the tsunami in Sri Lanka, and even in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina.
So even though the shock doctrine might seem like this unstoppable force, it's not inevitable.
Exactly. People are starting to wake up, to see through the propaganda. But to really understand how this fight is playing out, we need to look closer to home. We need to examine how the shock doctrine infiltrated the United States.
Wait, the U.S.? But isn't America like the heartland of capitalism? How could the shock doctrine take root there?
That's what we're going to explore next.
It's hard to wrap my head around the U.S. being a target for the shock doctrine. I mean, we practically invented free markets.
Right. You'd think we'd be immune, but it's more like A slow burn. It's not the sudden shock like in some other
Yeah,
countries.
it's not like a coup or a natural disaster.
Hmm.
But you're saying it's still happening.
Oh, yeah. The groundwork was laid a while back, decades ago, but it really started to take hold in the 80s, the Reagan era. Remember all that talk about smaller government, trickle-down
Oh,
economics?
yeah. Less government, more freedom for the markets.
Exactly. And while America never had that one big shock moment, those policies, they were steadily implemented. Tax cuts, deregulation, a tax on unions. It was like death by a thousand cuts.
And that trickled down, well, it didn't really trickle down to everyone, did it?
Not really, but if there's one event that really shifted things, it was Hurricane Katrina.
Katrina. That was a horrific tragedy. But I don't see how it fits into the shock doctrine.
Well, the Bush administration, they were already big on free markets. And when Katrina hit, they saw it as a chance to do things they couldn't normally do.
You mean they exploited the disaster?
In a way, yeah. They used it as an excuse to dismantle public services, especially in education. They shut down public schools, replaced them with charter schools, and public housing, demolished. All in the name of rebuilding, but it really benefited private companies.
So they used a crisis to push through an agenda that wouldn't have flown otherwise. It's a pretty cynical move.
It is. And Klein, she calls it disaster capitalism. And she's got other examples too, like the tsunami in Southeast Asia. After that, the government in Sri Lanka, they used the disaster as a reason to clear out coastal communities and build luxury resorts.
So people lost their homes so that tourists could have a place to vacation.
It's a pretty messed up situation, but the point is, this pattern, this disaster capitalism, it's happening all over. And it's not just natural disasters. Wars, economic crises, they all present opportunities for those in power to grab more power.
It's starting to feel like there's no escape from this shock doctrine. Is there any hope for pushing back?
There is. The first step is awareness, understanding the patterns, recognizing the tactics. Once you see it, it's harder to ignore.
So knowledge is power, huh?
Exactly. And Klein, she talks about these inspiring examples of resistance from all over the world. People organizing, protesting, creating alternative systems that actually work for everyone.
So even though it's a global problem, the solutions are local.
In a way, yeah. It's about building power from the ground up, creating communities that are resilient, that can withstand these shocks.
It makes sense. You can't rely on the top-down systems to change, so you have to build something new from the bottom up.
Exactly. And that's really the message of hope that Klein offers. It's not about despair. It's about recognizing that we have a choice. We don't have to accept the shock doctrine as inevitable. We can choose a different path.
A path that prioritizes people over profits. It's a good message, a hopeful message. Thanks for walking us through all this. It's been a real eye-opener.
Well, I could help.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the shock doctrine. It's a dense book, a complex topic, but hopefully this conversation has given you some food for thought. Remember, knowledge is power. Stay curious, stay engaged, and keep fighting for a better future. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.